But it's also an optimistic truth, right? Because when you see someone in the depths of genuine suffering, hopefully what you're trying to do is to throw a lifeline. And one possible lifeline is compassion. And that's probably the right lifeline to throw an infant, who's suffering. That sort of overwhelming compassion. But for someone who is an adult or making progress towards being an adult, the lifeline that might be thrown is there's something within you that would let you be more than you are, and much more, and maybe enough more so that you could actually deal with this suffering so it didn't turn into hell and take everything along with it. And there isn't anything more optimistic than that. You say something here, which I think is I'm going to read something from your book here. It is true that character is to some extent innate. I would say what that does is that it provides each of us with a range of talents and a range of temptations. And so it's something like that. So it's the hand we're dealt, and there's certainly a genetic element to that. Our genetic makeup imbues in us certain proclivities. But it is as true that character is mostly a consequence of choices. Strangely enough, we all make them, and we should make them deliberately with the knowledge that these choices are part of our responsibility toward a purpose other than our own selfish aims. That responsibility is to your family, friends, community, and country. That's something that conservatives put forward as a pathway to virtue. And what's so interesting about that, as far as I'm concerned, as an antidote to atomistic liberalism, let's say, that hyper-privileges the individual, is that it's definitely been my observation as a clinical psychologist that in the depths of misery, the capability that you have to be of service to other people, your family, your friends, your community, your country, that's actually a saving grace under such circumstances. And that people really find a deep and abiding meaning in that service. So it's not just finger wagging and the pointing towards duty. It's like, no, you don't understand that if you're in desperate straits, if your life has fallen apart, if you're nihilistic and miserable, and maybe you have your bloody reasons, because maybe you do, that's still the case that if you step outside yourself and you try to make the lives of other people better, that's the best possible thing that you can do for yourself. And so I really like that.
It's defining, what Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, this right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And, those words get thrown around a lot. And some people might say, well, pursue my happiness. That means pursue whatever ends I want, right? Pursue whatever gives me that short-term gratification. Pursue whatever makes me just feel good. But there's a difference. I don't think that's right. And I don't think that's what the founders meant. I think there's a lot of evidence for that, because what they meant was the pursuing of purpose. The idea that some sort of purpose in your life is what makes you happy, and that there is a given set of traditions and social interactions and standards of living that genuinely make people happy. One of those you mentioned is doing good for others. Some kind of service, having some kind of responsibility to feel useful. So it's not, we rely on the Bible a lot for this moral framework, but you don't have to if you don't want to, because you can look to basic psychology, I think, to derive the same conclusions. There just happens to be a lot of truth.
Well, one of the conclusions that you can draw, and we know this psychologically and psychophysiologically now, we know it neuropharmacologically, it's known from multiple dimensions simultaneously that the system that produces happiness, let's say in the founder's sense, produces that emotion in relationship to the observation of movement towards a valued goal. And so you can derive some conclusions from that. The first is that without a goal, there's no happiness by definition, because happiness marks movement towards a valued goal. The next is, the higher the goal, the more value there is in the observation of movement towards it. And so out of that, you might ask, well, then what's the highest goal? Because why don't we go for that? Well, then you could say, you should do your best for the best. You might say, that's just to make me hedonically happy. It's like, wait a second, cocaine will work for that, because it actually even activates this system. But what about tomorrow and next week and next month? And so the problem with hedonism as a goal is, first of all, it vanishes when you're suffering. But even failing that, if you're serving yourself hedonically in the narrow sense, it's just about me and my pleasure. It's like, okay, which you? Today's you, tomorrow's you, next week's you, next month's you. What about next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? You're going to lead a hedonic and dissolute life, and what are you going to be, a burnt out shell and a wreck, a dismal wreck in 10 years? Because that's what'll happen. And so if you don't construe yourself as a community stretched out across time, then you're not even serving yourself. And if you do construe yourself as a community stretched across time, then serving other people and serving yourself turn out to be exactly the same thing.
I have a question for you as I was hearing you go through this, and maybe I would have liked to maybe flesh this out in the book, but I didn't. Well, I'm also not a therapist, so probably best that I didn't try. But how do you advise people on how much they should give in to that pleasure seeking, that short-term gratification, just for because it does seem to me that just for the sake of sanity, there has to be some balance there. It's very difficult to be perfect.